Madam Toastmaster, to all Toastmasters, Amanda, Jerry, and Judy. I've finally met you after all these months. I don't know if you've noticed, but the Easter lilies are smelling pretty good over here. I'd like to begin tonight with asking you a question, and you can just withhold your answer. How many of you have ever been hurt by somebody, and even now it bothers you? I'd like to share with you the story of three men who I've known and their experiences in World War II and how they dealt with it. The first man, his name was George. He was a good friend of mine. George, in his mid-20s, found himself on the beaches of Normandy on D-Day. George was a medic, and his job was to patch up the wounded and to carry off the dead. I'm sure you can imagine it was quite a job. I won't go into details on what George shared with me, mostly because of time. But I will say that George himself was wounded 3 times, one time severely. He had to go to England to recuperate, and they brought him back just in time for the Battle of the Bulge. The temperatures were so cold one winter that parts of his feet actually froze solid. And toward the end of the war, George was captured by the Germans. George was a man of faith, and when he returned home, he was able to leave behind a lot of the baggage that most other guys carried with him. He picked up pretty much where he left off in life and was able to live a full, happy, and productive life. At the age of almost 92, George passed away peacefully in his sleep. There's another man I knew. His name was Dwayne. Different story. Dwayne was a man whose belief was that he would live, die, and be buried. That's all there was to it. He was a machine gunner on a battleship. And as much as I talked with Dwayne, I could get only bits and pieces of his story. But the little I put together was that many of his friends that were on that ship were killed in front of his eyes. He did tell me that one of his friends was literally vaporized when a bomb blew up almost on top of him. Others had lost arms and legs and even been cut in half by strafing a machine gun. And some were caught up in the wreckage of kamikaze aircraft that crashed on the decks and were burnt beyond recognition. There was one exception to his holding back, was a story that he continued to tell me of the time he was in his turret. A Japanese plane was headed right for him. He could tell that the plane had spent all of its ammunition and was going to crash right into him. He was able to kill the pilot, and as the pilot slumped over the controls, the aircraft veered away from him, crashed on the deck of another battleship, killing 2 other sailors. That event laid on him a burden of guilt that he would never be able to relieve himself of. When he came home from the war, he became a very frustrated and bitter man. And though he lived a long life, and many of us tried to help him work his way through it, he never was able to relieve himself of the guilt that turned to hatred. He died a hard death and was steadfast to the end. There's a third man that I knew, and his name I will withhold from you, and you'll know in a few minutes why. He found himself in the Philippines. On December 7th, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. The following day, December 8th of 1941, they bombed the Philippines, wiping out nearly the entire air defenses that were there. The Army was ill-supplied and under-equipped to maintain a full war. They did manage to hang on for 3 to 4 months, after which time the general who was in charge found no other alternative but to surrender to the Japanese. At that point, 75,000 men, 12,000 of whom were American soldiers, were marched without food, water, or rest, 80 miles up the Bataan Peninsula. It became known as the Bataan Death March. In the march alone, over 600 men died from beatings, beheadings, and outright murder and mistreatment by the Japanese. They ended up at a place called Camp O'Donnell, where they were dispersed throughout the Pacific to various POW camps, which turned out to be slave labor camps to support the Japanese war effort. This went on for 3.5 years until finally the atomic bomb and the invasion of Okinawa liberated these men. When my nameless friend returned home, he found the world a different place. Not only the world, but he himself was a different person. He was unable to hold a job, unable to maintain a relationship, and for the next 30 years he would relive the events of his captivity every night. At the age of about 58 years old, dying from cancer, he recalled the God that he had prayed to so many times before for deliverance, and this time he prayed for deliverance from his own hatred for the Japanese. His God responded and granted his request, and from that point on was able to live free from cancer, free from hatred, and at peace. He has been able to live, unlike some others that were liberated with him who had died at an early age, a very productive life, well into his 80s now. Perhaps some of you can relate with one of these three men. Maybe you're a George, someone who's able to just turn away from the bitterness and move on. I hope so. I wish I was a George, but I'm not. Perhaps you're a Dwayne, somebody who keeps records of everything that's ever been done to wrong you. I hope that's not the case. I think most of us lie somewhere between the two extremes. And wherever you lie on that graph, you have to come to a point where you say, enough's enough. I'm going to forgive, and I'm going to lay this down, and I'm going to carry on with my life. Someone you all know came to that point once. And what he did, he said, when I made the decision to forgive, I set a captive free. Little would I know, the captive had always been me.